Hello and welcome to our podcast that we are calling Governmental Structure, Tic-Tac-Toe. In this, we'll be talking about some important constitutional principles such as federalism and the ideas of checks and balances and separation of powers. So let's go ahead and see what we're talking about. So this massive chart here, this is our tic-tac-toe board that we'll be talking about throughout the presentation. And so you can see across the top, we have the three branches of government. We have the executive branch, legislative, and then judicial. And then down the left-hand side, you can see the different levels of government. We have the federal level, which is at the national level, state, and then local. And so across the columns, executive, legislative, and judicial, that's where we're going to be talking about separation of powers and the idea of checks and balances a little bit. And then down the left-hand side, the federal, state, and local is where we talk about the concept of federalism, where the idea that the national government trumps the other levels. So let's go ahead and take a look at each one in a little bit more detail. So what exactly is this structure? The idea is each level, each federal, state, or local level has three different branches. And so again, we call the leveling federalism, the idea that the federal or the national government trumps the others. Within the branches, though, we can talk about principles like separation of powers. And this is where certain powers are delegated to each branch so that not any one branch can become too powerful. And so why do we care about this tic-tac-toe pattern? We basically wanted to show you the names of the governmental offices in each branch and at each level. And so we can see the terms and the names and the offices that we will be using when we're talking about going up the ladder from the local to state to federal level, but also to show the names of the groups within each branch. So the legislative branch at the federal level might be called Congress, whereas at the state level it might be called something different, and also might be different from the local level as well. So let's go ahead and look at the legislative branch in specific. So this is where bills originate. This is where the legislature decides on public policy. This is where they craft ideas that could become potential laws that would help govern our nation, our state, or our local level. Now, at many levels, there are two houses in the legislative branch. So, for example, if you look there in the middle column, you can see that Congress has the House of Representatives and also the Senate. If you move down to the state level, here in Colorado, where we're creating this, we talk about the State Assembly for Colorado. And it also has two houses. We have a state House of Representatives and we have a state Senate. And so in the legislative branch here, even at the state level, we have a bicameral legislature, meaning two houses. And as far as I know, 49 out of 50 states have bicameral state legislatures. The only one that I'm aware of that has a unicameral legislative branch at the state level is Nebraska. Moving down the level, you would have the local or city or maybe county level. And so oftentimes the name of the legislative branch there would be something like town council, village council, whatever they're using to describe their town, county, or village. If we move over to the judicial branch, the power of that branch is to make sure that these laws are in effect legal and more specifically constitutional. So for example, if a city creates an ordinance, which is what we call a law at the city level about anything, the city courts may look at that and ask, is it appropriate based on the various constitutions that govern that city? So the Broomfield Charter, or perhaps the Colorado Constitution, or perhaps even the federal Constitution. Their job is to be an unbiased group, judging laws and making sure that they are correct according to the different constitutions that govern each level. Now, to an extent, at the federal level, the Supreme Court could, in effect, make law. And so it's not like a normal progression where a bill becomes a law by going through the legislative branch and then being signed by the executive branch. The Supreme Court could, in effect, make law based on its Supreme Court rulings. For example, we could go through the history of the Supreme Court and talk about various cases where the court ruled one way or the other, but we'll talk about a couple specific ones here. 1954, in Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that public schools cannot segregate based on race, that all children, regardless of color or race or creed or whatnot, need to go to school together. So since the Supreme Court said that that is what needs to happen in this nation, in effect, that has become law. They did not craft a bill, move it through the legislative branch, go to the executive and have it signed. But when the Supreme Court was judging a current law, which said that schools could be segregated, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that, since it is judging the law against the Constitution, which is our highest law of the land, then in effect, when Brown versus Board, which was a Supreme Court case, came to be, they created the law that kids have to be allowed to go to school with each other. Segregation is illegal. So if we go to our third branch, which is the executive branch, this is the branch whose responsibility it is to execute and enforce the laws. So when a bill becomes law, either through the legislative branch proposing a bill and the executive branch signing it into law, or if the Supreme Court rules on an issue, that becomes law. It now becomes the executive branch's job to make sure that law is carried out. And that could be through the finding and punishing of criminals who break the law, as in the police, FBI, things like that. It could also be through regulatory agencies whose job it is to make sure that the law, once it's in place, is followed correctly, in a preemptive way. So for example, if the law is that you must ensure that foods are safe before they go into the food system, the FDA's job is to make sure that foods are safe ahead of time. They want to make sure that people are butchering meat properly, that they are cleaning the machines that do all this properly, so that food initially gets into the system in a proper way. They also have the power, if they find out that people have broken the law, that they can go in and shut these places down and basically enforce the law and saying, hey, you didn't keep the food clean, we now need to close you down. But in effect, the executive branch is a large branch challenged with enforcing and executing all of the laws created by the legislative and sort of by the judicial branch. And so if you were to look at a federal level executive branch image of all the different agencies who are tasked with keeping the laws in place, there are a bunch of federal agencies required to enforce and execute the law. You can see some of them here. The FDA keeps an eye on our food. Even the Forest Service keeps an eye on all the laws regarding the use of public lands. TSA, or the Transportation Security Administration, they make sure that our airlines are safe, that we have properly checked everybody who's coming on an airplane. The CDC works on keeping the nation healthy, studying disease, enforcing laws of cleanliness and sanitization. So those first three branches we looked at, legislative, judicial, and executive branch, those are in effect the ideas of separation of powers and checks and balances, so that not any one office becomes too powerful in this whole process of creating laws, enforcing, judging them. Now, if we move to the left-hand side of our chart and move up the rows, we're going to see the idea of federalism in play. So we can start at the lowest level, or the local level. This would be a city, a township, a county, whatever a small entity is going to call itself. And so you can see that this is going to be responsible for running local level concerns. And so you can see at the local level, we call the executive branch person the mayor. If you move over to the legislative branch, they probably call that group the town council or something like that. And then the judicial branch at the local level would be your local courts. If you move up a level of the federalism chart, you can see the idea of the state government. We have 50 states, therefore we have 50 state governments. And so they keep an eye on everything that happens within that state. And so their powers come from the 10th Amendment that basically said any powers not explicitly given to the federal government are reserved for the states. So for example, education. As of this moment, education is still a state-controlled issue, although there are inroads from the federal level in the new concept called the Common Core, where basically the federal government is suggesting, hey, let's get all 50 state governments on the same page in terms of education. But at the root, education is still a state-level issue. License plates, marriage licenses, those types of things are reserved for each state to decide how they do each of those entities. And so the executive branch at the state level we call a governor. The legislative branch at the state level might be called the state assembly. And as we mentioned before, most states still have two houses within the state assembly, a House and a Senate kind of thing. And then the judicial branch at each state is going to be the state courts. So if there is a state-level issue that's going on and somebody's questioning a state law, those would be brought not to the local level, but to the state level, because it's going to apply to the entire state. And so if we move up the federalism chart one more level, we get the federal level. And so this is the idea that the federal government trumps all others. So if the federal government says that A or B is legal, then that's how it needs to be in all 50 states. And so we've had many tests to this idea throughout our nation's history, where states want to say, hey, but this is how we want to do it in Alabama or Texas or Colorado or wherever. But we've had many high-profile cases where the idea of federalism, that the national government trumps all others, has been reinvigorated. Probably the most obvious is the idea of the American Civil War in the 1860s. States wanted to say, we each wanted slavery, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia. That's what they were arguing, and that it's a state issue and the federal government should butt out. Lincoln basically said, no, that's not how it's going to be, and we have a war. And since the North or the Union won, that reinvigorated the idea that the federal government trumps all others. Yes, Alabama may have its ideas on X, Y, or Z, but the federal government has potentially different ideas, and those are the ones that will trump. We've also had issues during the civil rights era, and most recently we've had issues over drug laws, where certain states have started to legalize recreational marijuana, where the federal level is still that is a controlled substance and it is not legal. Additionally, same-sex marriage has come up within the last 10 years. Certain states have started to issue same-sex marriage licenses. Traditionally has been a state issue. If Iowa wants to allow two people to marry who are of the same sex, it was left to Iowa. They could do what they wanted. As momentum for that movement has grown, more and more states have said, yes, it is acceptable in X, Y, or Z state that you may marry someone of the same sex. And until recently, that was left to the states. And so various states made amendments to their constitution that either said, yes, you can, or no, you can't. In the 90s, there was the Federal Defense of Marriage Act that said, no, you cannot. And so you get various states saying, yes, you can marry same-sex couples. But then you have the Federal Law of Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA, that said you could not. Now, recently, DOMA was overturned. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that at the federal level. So in effect, it then kind of tumbled down to the state level, where each state could decide how they wanted to run that issue. And most recently, the Supreme Court decided not to hear potential challenges on the legality of state amendments. It's a very complicated issue, but same-sex marriage, drug laws, civil rights were often seen to be, should the state be able to control all those, or is that a federal level issue? And time again, we have these cases where the federal level comes in and says, this is the way it's going to be, not just for one state, but for all 50. And so you can see the names of the offices that are in each branch. So at the federal level, you see the executive branch, the office is that of the president, and then his or her executive offices and all the regulatory agencies that help enforce and enact the law. The legislative branch we call Congress. And again, our national level legislative branch has two houses, House of Representatives and the Senate. And then the judicial branch at the federal level is the Supreme Court, and then all the federal level courts. There's some federal district courts that handle a couple states' issues at a time, but ultimately the judicial branch is the Supreme Court at the federal level. And so that's about it for our governmental structure tic-tac-toe. We will go into each of these elements in a little bit more depth in other podcasts, but we just wanted to make you aware of a couple issues. One, that our government is broken up into branches, executive, legislative, and judicial, that they have separation of powers, and that there are checks and balances in place. Additionally, that we have a local, state, and federal level system, basically federalism, where each time you move up a level, that trumps the lower level. And ultimately, the federal government retains the most power to create, enforce, and enact the laws for this nation as a whole. As always, if you have any questions, please go ahead and bring those into class. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.